Time bhalla muid am around le teachta Paul McAuliffe, sé nóméid dums agus ceithre nóméid de teachta McAuliffe le the whole Lascan Corla. I'd like to, on behalf of government, I'd like to thank deputies opposite, and particularly the members of the opposition who brought this bill forward, which would amend the Residential Tenancies Act 2004 to 2021, and specifically includes safeguards in relation to student rents and protections that should apply to students. And I certainly agree with a number of speakers that the lessons of the pandemic lessons should be learned from it, and where additional protections need to be put in place, that we should do so. I would particularly, though, like to thank the USI, Union of Students in Ireland, for their input and the preparation of this bill. As was mentioned by one of the speakers opposite, this is their bill, it's their work and their legislation that they have put together, and I really welcome the engagement that they've had with opposition parties and indeed with government. Myself and Minister Harris has met them too, Deputy McAuliffe, and I know deputies opposite as well have met them, and it's a good avenue that we can see that students can bring their issues with solutions and proposed solutions that they can bring forward. Further to the legislation as well, just to advise the House that I will be re-engaging a working group between my own department in housing and Minister Harris's Department of Higher Education to ensure there's ongoing cooperation between the two departments, and we act in tandem and in concert as best as possible in relation to the issue, particularly of student accommodation, which is still an area of concern. The bill is helpful, it is very timely, and the debate this morning, and certainly I would be pleased to support it to go to pre-legislative scrutiny. And I think Deputy O'Brien mentioned earlier, I think it's appropriate to say that further measures last year actually that we brought forward in the previous Oireachtas, working in cooperation, myself and Deputy O'Brien, others on the Housing Committee, indeed with former Minister Owen Murphy as well, where we were able to bring in some measures under the RTB and work together well with the USI on it. And I want to continue that collaborative approach. The key objective of this bill is to limit the amount of rent payable in advance by students, therefore limiting their exposure to losing quite significant sums. There are some things we'll need to work through in the bill. I would like to advise people that, and deputies, that my department, in consultation with Minister Harris's department, have been working on a general scheme of the Housing and Residential Tenancies Bill, which will provide similar protections, but across the entire residential rental sector, not just specific to specific student accommodation. And that would, I'll go into that in a little bit more detail further on, but I do accept and recognise that the private member's bill here aims to help in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, but the government's bill, which I'll be bringing forward and I expect to enact this year, will help all tenants for the long term. And that's what we need to ensure, that we've long-term fixes, not just reactions to what's happened through the COVID pandemic. And I will work to ensure the best aspects of this bill are teased out and are integrated into that legislation. As it stands, the Residential Tenancies Act do not prescribe, as we know, specific terms and conditions regarding the payment of rents, deposits or refunds for inclusion in individual letting arrangements in the private rental market, including the student-specific accommodation sector. Contract law does govern such arrangements, and the specific terms associated with those and the obligations are likely to be set out in a written contract signed by both the student and the landlord. However, I am committed to working with all interested parties to see how we can strengthen this and provide clarity in those areas. The Act do provide that disputes relating to non-refund of deposits and rent setting may be referred to the RTB, and that's changes that we made actually in the last Oireachtas. So that is something that I intend that we would continue to do. Any further amendment to the Residential Tenancies Act to govern specific terms and conditions regarding refunds payable on foot of COVID-19 under individual letting arrangements in student-specific accommodation sector would need to be carefully considered, and that's why I think the opportunity for this to go to the Joint Oireachtas Committee is a welcome one. I do wish to advise deputies that the general scheme of a housing and residential tenancies bill that I intend to bring to government for approval in the very near future does include proposals to restrict the amount of any upfront payments of rent and deposits across the private rental sector. So not just on student accommodation, I want to go further than that to restrict that level of deposit across the sector, and that bill is being worked on as I speak. And subject to government approval, to give deputies some insight into what that will be, the bill will aim to provide that all tenants in the residential rental sector, including but not limited to students, would only be required to make an upfront payment on tenancy commencement that does not exceed an amount to 1 month's rent plus 1 month's deposit. Thereafter, only 1 month's rent can be payable in advance, that a landlord will be legally obliged to adhere to this practice, and that non-compliance by a landlord with this obligation could be referred by a tenant for dispute resolution to the RTB. Now, I'll be working through those individual and the bill itself with the Joint Oireachtas Committee. But the provision in the government bill for a maximum upfront payment would protect all tenants and counter discrimination, in particular for lower income groups, and that's what we want to do. So I think this debate here this morning and the bill brought forward by the USI is very timely in that regard. Some of the changes and protections I want to bring in across the rental market, not just specific to students, but I welcome the debate today, look forward to it going for legislative scrutiny, and I'll hand over to my colleague Deputy McAuliffe.